Hello, we are the Association for Child and Adolescent Mental Health, or ACAM for short.
I'm going to now move on to the introduction of our speaker for this evening. We're really fortunate that David Trickey has given us some time this evening. And David, we are indeed very grateful to you, because this topic, I think, more than any that we've had recently, is one that I hear teachers talking about with great sincerity and passion, but not always an in-depth understanding. And this is a great opportunity for us. David, as some of you may know, is a leading consultant clinical psychologist who's specialised for many years in working with traumatised children, young people and their families. He's a chartered psychologist with the British Psychological Society, and he's registered with the Health and Care Professionals Council. David continues to focus very much on direct clinical work, as well as the training and supervision of others working with traumatised children, young people and their families. David presents at international conferences and supervises doctoral research. He acts as an expert witness in civil and criminal cases. Many of you will have read the headlines recently about the rises in domestic abuse, for example, and if children have witnessed those episodes, then certainly we're looking at children who've experienced some trauma. And one of David's specialisms is particularly supporting families where there's been a family homicide. He was a member of the committee back in 2018 that revised the NICE guidelines on post-traumatic stress disorder, another issue that very recent research evidence shows emerging in children and young people. But in all of these roles, David very much relies on the research literature to inform and direct his evidence-based practice. David, welcome, and over to you when you unmute yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barry, and thank you, everyone. I'm just going to multitask briefly whilst I try and share my screen. Looking good. Here we go. Now, I'm hoping you can see a slide that says understanding trauma. If someone could just let me know that's what you can see, that would be really useful. Yeah.
All good.
Great. Thank you. And one other thing I'll say before I really get going is I'm going to be talking about trauma and the way it affects people. And I don't know about your histories. I don't know what you're going through at the moment in your lives. And sometimes this stuff sneaks up on us, particularly in the evenings when we're not expecting it to. So if for whatever reason you start to feel overwhelmed rather than just moved by anything that we're talking about, please do what you need to do to look after yourself. So that might mean you need to step away. It might mean that tonight isn't the time to be doing this stuff. Or it might mean you need to talk it through with someone before you sort of finish off your day's work. So please do take responsibility for looking after yourself. And what I'm going to try and do in just 30 minutes is explain how trauma works. And I'm going to use a particular psychological approach called the cognitive model, because that seems to do a good job of explaining how it works. Then I want to talk a little bit about how people react to traumatic events. And again, I'm going to use post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, as a way to think about reactions. And then I want to spend a bit of time thinking with you about how schools and colleges can really help to provide that environment where young people are most likely to recover from trauma. Now, as Barry said, I went to school when I was a youngster, like many people in the UK, but unlike some people, that I don't think that makes me an expert in schools at all. You know, I know a bit about children and trauma, and I'm hoping to share that knowledge with you. But how you apply that in your schools, actually, you're the experts on your schools, you're the experts on your children and young people. And I hope that we can perhaps have some discussions, and maybe people can share ideas that they've had and way that they've applied some of these principles in their schools. That would be really useful. So the cognitive model of post-traumatic stress disorder really describes how potentially traumatic events may affect people. And the model relies on memory, meaning, and maintenance. Now, the first thing is about memory then. So if I asked you about the last time you went to the cinema, you would locate that normal event memory, bring it to mind, tell us the story of going to the cinema, and then you would put it back in its place. It would stay there pretty much. But when events are traumatic, when they are scary, when people are overwhelmed with the helplessness or the horror or the pain or the disgust or whatever it is, at those moments, memories are stored in a different format. They're laid down in a different way. So instead of having the narrative, the story, they have the data of the event. So when you tell me about the cinema, you might not remember what the cinema smelt like. You might not remember what the touch of the seat was like, or exactly the colors that you saw. You would have the story, the narrative, but you might not have the actual data, because traumatic memories are stored as the sight, smells, taste, touches, the sensations, the feelings, and the thoughts. And traumatic memories tend to be very volatile. So they're very easily triggered and they intrude spontaneously. So rather than us finding a memory on purpose and bringing it to mind, these traumatic memories, they sort of fall into people's consciousness. And traumatic memories tend to be very fragmented. They have the disorganized pieces rather than the complete coherent narrative. And when they come to mind, they have a very much a here and now feel rather than a there and then feel. They tend to be distressing. So the original distress of the event comes with them, and they tend to be avoided because they're unpleasant. People try to avoid them. And just to try and illustrate this idea of these two different memory systems, I want to tell you about an experiment that was done in the States where they took adults with post-traumatic stress disorder, they placed them in the brain scanner, and they then activated different types of memories. So normal memories and then the trauma memories. And they noticed all the different parts of the brain that were activated. And then they could see which parts of the brain were only activated by normal events and which parts of the brain were only activated by traumatic ones. Now, Broca's area, one of the language centers of the brain, is only activated by neutral memories, by normal everyday events. So people would be lying in the brain scanner and the researcher would say, do you remember the time you went to the cinema? And Broca's area would be activated. Do you remember the time you went for a walk in the park? Broca's area comes online. Do you remember the time you were assaulted in the city? Broca's area doesn't come online. So when we talk about things being too terrible for words, I think that's what this brain scan shows. That part of the brain is not being involved in the memories for traumatic events. And when they turn it around the other way, there's all sorts of parts of the brain which are activated by traumatic memories, but not by normal memories. The amygdala, which is like the alarm center of the brain, is only activated by the trauma memory. The secondary visual cortex, a bit of the brain that brings together the elements for a visual image, only activated by trauma memories. And the insula, a part of the brain that's important for imagining what something would be like, only activated by the trauma memories. So there seems to be a lot of support for this idea that we have these two different types of memory. That's really the part of the memory bit of the story. And then we have the meaning bit. Now, if you imagine that we have certain beliefs, certain expectations about what's supposed to happen, the way the world is supposed to work, and that set of beliefs acts like a lens through which we see the world. And that lens will color things and filter out things that don't fit. So, for example, I live in Cambridge and I sometimes work in London. If I believed that Cambridge was very friendly, I would start to notice all the friendly people in Cambridge, and that would confirm my beliefs. And then I would come to London, I would notice all the unfriendly people in London, where I am today, no offense, everyone outside the door. And that would confirm my beliefs. But I may then even act in a way that confirms those beliefs. So I go to buy a coffee in Cambridge, and because I'm in Cambridge, I talk to the person selling me a coffee. And because I speak to them, they speak to me back, and I get on the train thinking they're so warm and friendly up here in Cambridge. And then when I go to buy some lunch in London, because I'm in London, I don't talk to the person I'm buying it from. They don't talk to me, and it confirms my ideas. Now, if something doesn't fit, we can either ignore it. So this lens can also filter out events that don't fit with our beliefs, or we can distort it. So I bump into someone in London and they're really friendly, and I think they're probably from Cambridge for the day, just visiting. I find some way to hold on to my beliefs because I don't want to change my beliefs every time something happens. But if an event comes along that is too big to ignore and you can't explain it away, then actually your beliefs do give way. And some people talk about this being shattering your assumptions and the catastrophic message of the event taking precedence over everything else. But at the very least, we can think about these events as coloring the way we see the world. And then even when those events have passed, we're left with this trauma-based view of things, and that colors what we think, what we feel, and what we do. And I'm going to give you a few examples of this in a moment. There are some quite common post-traumatic beliefs and thoughts, these ideas that people take with them, if you like, the message of the trauma. So even though the trauma is back there, they've taken with them certain ideas, and they tend to be grouped around self, world, and others. So some traumatized young people will think, I should have stopped it. It's my fault. I'm no good. This stuff always happens to me. They might start to believe that things are completely unpredictable. Everywhere is dangerous, not just that street at that moment, but actually everywhere. They might start to think that nothing makes sense anymore. They might start to develop beliefs about others. You can't trust other people. Other people are violent. Everyone important leaves to me. Or people that are supposed to look after me, they're the ones that hurt me the most. And these can be incredibly unhelpful beliefs to take forwards into life. They might have been really useful back then when the things were happening, but for some people, they're past their sell-by date and they carry them forward into a safer area. So that's a very quick overview of memory and meaning. And then the maintenance comes in because of avoidance. So the difficulties they may have are maintained often by avoidance. Now, these unprocessed memories intrude into consciousness. That's part of their nature, maybe through flashbacks where you re-feel what was happening, or nightmares, or just very vivid thoughts. And because that brings with it the original fear or horror or helplessness, people try really hard not to think about that stuff. But because they try hard not to think about it, they end up not processing it, not creating the narrative, not telling the story. But also that very act of avoidance actually triggers the memory. People might go, I really don't want to remember, and they've just triggered the thing they don't want to remember. One boy said to me, it's like a boomerang. The harder I throw it away, the harder it comes back and hits me. And people also get stuck in an external trap of avoidance where this unprocessed memory, very volatile, falls into consciousness very easily. So people try and avoid the triggers. And that avoidance actually denies them one of the opportunities to process the event. If you were coming to work one day and you saw a cyclist being knocked off by a bus, and the ambulance arrived, you could hear the sirens getting louder and louder, and a paramedic pushed you out of the way and got through, and in fact the cyclist was fine. The next day, as you walk down that road, you would almost certainly think, oh, yesterday when I was here, this happened and then that happened. And that's one of the ways that you start to process the event and create the narrative. But if you go, well, I'm not walking down that road because of what happened yesterday, I'm going down that road. First of all, you deny yourself that opportunity to process the event, but also just by making that decision, you end up triggering the very thing you're trying not to remember. I don't want to go down there because, well, there it is. You've reminded yourself again. Now, how do we explain this to children, young people, and families? Well, we have a number of stories. The first is about a chocolate factory. A chocolate factory takes the ingredients, the sugar, the milk, and the cocoa, mixes them up into bars of chocolate, and then puts a wrapper around them. And on the wrapper, you have words on the outside that tells you what's on the inside. It says ingredients and lists them. And in some ways, our brains are similar. We have the experiences, the sights, smells, tastes, the touches, and we create a memory, and then we wrap it up with a narrative. So we have words on the outside that tells us about the contents. But with the chocolate factory, if the sugar was not ground down enough, it was in big lumps, or if the milk was too hot, the machinery wouldn't be able to work, wouldn't be able to process those ingredients. So it grinds to a halt, and you end up with the ingredients just swirling around on the factory floor. And in some ways, our brains are similar. If we don't want to think about something because it's too horrible, the ingredients, the experiences are too painful to bring to mind, well, we can't process them then. So we try not to, and we end up with those ingredients, if you like, the sights, smells, tastes, and touches swirling around in our minds. Now, with the chocolate factory, you might just wait until the milk has cooled down, or you might need to take the sugar and grind it down into smaller pieces. And you might need to get someone in to help you, and then you can start to process your chocolate bars. Another way we explain it is by thinking about a wardrobe. Now, a wardrobe, you have all your clothes put away. When you need them, you take them out. When you finish with them, you put them back and they stay put. And similarly, we have our memories for different events. They're stored away. When we need them, we bring them out. When we're finished with them, we put them back, and they pretty much stay put. But with the wardrobe, if someone threw you a duvet full of stinging nettles and said, put it away quick, and it hurts to hold on to you. So you shove it in the back of the wardrobe and you close the door. And whilst you keep your hand on the door, you might be able to keep it put, but every now and then you take your hand off and it falls out and stings you again, and you shove it away again. And in some ways, our brains are similar. Events we don't want to think about, we try to shove them in the back of our minds. And what if we keep ourselves really busy, we might be able to avoid thinking about them for a certain amount of time, but then suddenly, perhaps between going to bed and going to sleep, that's when they fall in and they sting us and they hurt us, and we try and push them away again. So with the wardrobe, you might find that you have to take it out. You might get someone in to help you, and that might be painful. And you're going to fold up that duvet, move things around, and then put it away, and it will stay put. So we're not getting rid of it. We're just storing it in a way where it's going to stay there until we want it or need it. And similarly with traumatic memories that we don't want to be thinking about, and they keep intruding, if we get someone to help us perhaps, and if we think it through on purpose and deliberately, and if we adjust the way we see the world and other people and ourselves, then we can store that event, and then it stays put. I was explaining this to a 14-year-old from Kosovo I was working with, and we'd had several sessions of therapy, and he said, it's a bit like that, David, but actually it's more like this. And he got the waste paper bin and he filled it up with scrunched up pieces of paper. He said, these are all the bad things that have happened to me. And as I walk to school, they fall in front of my eyes. And as I lie down and go to sleep, they fall into my dreams. But when I come and see you, we take them out of the bin and we unscrunch them. Then we read them through carefully. Then we fold them up neatly and we put them back in the bin. But because they're folded up neatly, it means they don't fall out of the top of the bin, and I've got more room in my head to think about other things. And I was sat there with my notes going, what's that last bit about more room in your head? So there's ways that we can explain this memory, the meaning, and the maintenance to people. But let me try and bring it all together and give you an example. This is an example based on one of the clients I've been working with recently. He believed the world was safe enough, believed that he was okay and that other people would be nice. And he had a number of family members that were ill because of COVID, and his grandparent died. This was quite early on in the pandemic. And those events colored the way he saw things. He suddenly started to believe that the world was dangerous. And there was plenty information, and that message was very much being drilled into all of us. The world out there is dangerous. He started to believe that he was vulnerable because so many of his family had been ill. He started to believe that others might not be trusted. There was some story that he had that perhaps very early on in the pandemic, the doctors had to choose who they were going to keep alive, and they might not have chosen his granddad. Now, even after that event had passed, he was left with this view of the world, which was difficult to update. So when the schools reopened and the pupils returned, he saw that return through his lens. The world is dangerous, I'm vulnerable, I can't trust others to keep me safe. So he thought, if I go to school, I'll get it. I might die, I might infect other people again. So that made him incredibly fearful. So understandably, he refused to go to school. He became increasingly isolated from his friends. And this avoidance just maintained his belief about the world being too dangerous to leave. And he said that sometimes he could remember the paramedics arriving to collect his granddad, or how he imagined his granddad died. And these images would intrude to remind him of how dangerous the world was. So here we see the memory and the meaning working together. I want to give you another example, if that's okay. This is another boy I worked with, John, who was referred after he had apparently attacked the school teacher. Now, John had a couple of years where his stepfather was attacking his mother, and occasionally John and his sister would be attacked as well. So this repeated domestic violence changed the way he saw the world. He started to believe that he was vulnerable, the world was dangerous, and other people are violent. Eventually, his mother was able to leave, his stepdad, so that event had passed, but he still had the message of the trauma. And one day he was in his class, and the teacher raised his voice above the classroom hubbub. But as he did so, he happened to be walking towards John, and he happened to be raising his finger, and he happened to catch John's eye. So he was just saying, come on, settle down. But as he did that, John caught his eye, and remember, this is John's experience. I know what angry white males do, when they're coming towards me. So he immediately thought, he's going to hit me. And he had this, what some people call an amygdala hijack, where his alarm system takes over and he lashes out. And this teacher who was just walking, telling them to settle down a bit, suddenly gets attacked by this 16-year-old. So he kind of wrestles him off. And that wrestling, John then sees as, see, I told you he was going to attack me. So his actions ended up creating an event that just confirmed his idea about the world being dangerous. Now, how do difficulties progress over time? Well, you could think about it in 4 different ways. You could think about these different trajectories or paths. There'll be some people that, following difficult, potentially traumatic events, they start with a really high level of distress and difficulties. But actually, over time, over the days and weeks that follow, that distress and those difficulties decrease. And you might think of that as recovery. There'll be some people that actually seem pretty unaffected. A lot of young people sail through some really difficult things and appear to be unaffected. So we might think of those people as being unaffected. There'll be some that develop difficulties that endure, and there'll be a small proportion that seem to be doing okay, and then later on will develop difficulties, perhaps even into adulthood. And one way of thinking about these difficulties would be to think about post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, I'm not saying it's important to make a diagnosis of PTSD or not, but I think it provides a useful framework. And I'm going to use a particular classification system, which is the DSM. It happens to be the American version. A lot of our research is based on this way of thinking about PTSD. You have to experience a potentially traumatic event, which might be something really horrific or really threatening. And then you would have some symptoms, some difficulties to do with intrusions. It might be you're having nightmares, or the memory is pushing itself into your mind, or you're having flashbacks where you re-feel whatever it was you felt at the time. Or young children might play out what happened to them, or elements of what happened to them, or it might seep into their drawings or their schoolwork. You might get some elements of their trauma history coming into their written work. Or they might just get really upset or really scared when they're reminded. Then you get some difficulties associated with avoidance, where they're trying to avoid things inside their head or trying to avoid things outside that might trigger the event. Then you get some difficulties to do with arousal and reactivity. So when most of us experience a stressful event, we would kind of have perhaps a shot of adrenaline to help us deal with the stressor, whether it's staying up late to revise for an exam or pushing someone off who's trying to get our phone, whatever it is. And then when that stressor has passed, our arousal rate goes back to resting. But if you experience an event that's traumatic rather than stressful, actually your arousal level struggles to go back to resting. You end up much more hyped up, which makes you more irritable, because if you're now operating at this level, it doesn't take much to push you over the top. People find it really difficult to concentrate on what we want them to concentrate because they're so hypervigilant. So they may not be paying attention to what you're trying to teach them, because that probably isn't a threat. But what are those kids doing outside in the corridor? And what are those people doing behind me? And what's happening in the playground? These things I need to keep an eye on. So their brain is trying to keep them safe by attending to these potential threats. And it's difficult to sleep. It's difficult to turn off. There may be a group of difficulties to do with thoughts and feelings, where they can't remember certain parts of the event, or they have these exaggerated negative beliefs or distorted thoughts, or they may get stuck in one emotion, one negative emotion, perhaps feeling constantly angry or constantly sad. They may start to have less to do with the things they used to enjoy. They may feel detached from others, and they may be just not feel anything. It's emotional numbing. It has to have gone on for at least a month, or we don't call it PTSD. And that's because many people will have these difficulties to begin with, but many will lose them over time. And it has to be causing a problem, or we wouldn't call it PTSD. I just wanted to show you this graph, which shows the rate. This is based on a number of different studies where they've taken the average. How many young people, what percentage would have PTSD at different time points after the events? And you can see quite a high level of PTSD at 1 month. It comes down, and around about 6 months, it sort of bottoms out. So if you're struggling with something like PTSD at 6 months, it's unlikely you're going to have any more spontaneous recovery. So if you're working with young people and you know they've been through some really difficult things, but that was 6 months ago and they're struggling now, we can no longer rely on spontaneous recovery. We need to find out what else is going to help, what additional support do they need to help get them back on track. And in terms of what can you do, what can be done in schools to maximize the chances of recovery? If I see a young person for therapy, that's maybe 1 hour a week. That means there's 167 hours in that week where they're with other people. And a lot of that time is spent at school. How can we create the environment in those other 167 hours, or at least some of them, where they are most likely to recover? Well, there's been a really good literature review of the evidence. So when you look at all the evidence out there, what's going to help, this large group of authors reviewed that evidence and brought it together and summarized it with just 5 principles. And what I love about this article is that these are really common sense. There's no surprises here, and it's based on the evidence, and it's not a manual. It's not saying what you must do when. They are just guidelines telling you the sorts of things you might want to think about. So if you had a critical incident in your school and you phoned me and said, what are we going to do? I would remind you of these 5 principles. And I would say, I don't know your school. I don't know your children. I don't know your staff. But what can you do to promote these 5 things? How can you help them to feel safe? That's number 1. Not just to be safe, but to feel safe. How can you help them to calm down? And the problem is that some of your young people are going to need different things to help them calm down. Some might want to read a book. Some might want to do some art and crafts. Some might want to go and play football. But you are already experts at dealing with those different needs. How do you help them to feel a sense of self-efficacy and community efficacy? That means, how do you help them to feel they have control over what's happening to them and they can make meaningful choices? How do you help them to feel connected? Social support is really important. It's almost like an antidote to trauma sometimes. How can we really enhance that social support? And how can we instill a sense of hope? Not minimizing what's happened, but actually help them to think about the future in a positive way, whilst holding on to not holding on to the things that have happened, but not kind of invalidating them. I'm going to skip over these. These were some of the ideas I had about each of these principles, but just given the time, I'd really like to move on so that we can have more questions and, who knows, maybe even some answers. In terms of sense of safety, that familiarity and consistency can be really important. So I think that's really worth mentioning. And in terms of calming, I would just say teachers and staff in schools and colleges are already brilliant at getting children into whatever you want to call it, the window of tolerance or the zone of learning, in terms of having them not asleep and bored, but not hyper aroused and over the top. You already do this every day. You get groups of children to be in that zone where they can learn. The problem is, if they're traumatized, they're more likely to whiz out the top of it. So you just do exactly what you would normally do, but you just have to work harder at it, I think. How can you help them to feel they have some control? So that might be about choices. That might be about teaching them strategies to regulate their emotions, because then they start to feel they have control. How can you help them to feel connected? So what group activities can you do with this established group to help them following the trauma? And how do you help them to think in the future? What are we going to be doing in a year's time, in 2 years' time? How are we going to be different? In terms of identifying if they need additional support, there's no hard and fast rules here. So we don't have a questionnaire, and if they score above 17, that's it. You refer them to your local child and adolescent mental health services. It's not as simple as that. But there are some things that you might want to think about. One is severity. You know, how severe are their difficulties? So they just feel a little low, or are they absolutely despondent and hopeless? And how long do the episodes go on for? If they lose their temper, do they get over it in a few minutes, or does it last all day? And how often is this happening? Are they having a bad dream once a fortnight or twice a night? And broadly speaking, which direction are things going? Are they sort of getting better, or actually are they getting worse or staying the same? How much of a problem does it cause? And how long have things been going on? Are we talking 2 days after the traumatic events or 2 years after? So these are some things that you might need to think about. And I've just got two more things to say, really. One is, you, as a group of staff working with children and young people, will have had, some of you will have had your own experience of traumatic events. And actually, over the last 2 years, all of us have experienced more, at least stress, if not trauma. And there's more trauma around that the children will have experienced. So you are highly likely to hear a lot of these stories, and highly likely perhaps to have your own emotional reactions triggered. And so it's fundamental to the well-being of the children that you do what you need to do to look after yourself. You need to be in the best shape possible so that you can help those young people. Some of the parents I work with say, oh, it's if they're okay, I'll be okay. But actually it works both ways. The adults around the children need to be okay enough to help the children to be okay. And the last thing I'll say is, traumatized children with their unbalanced trauma-based beliefs, their intrusive memories, and this persistent hyperarousals, they don't make for good learners. And those of you working in schools are busy trying to teach. You're not therapists, and I don't think you should be either. However, a good school or college with its structure, its routines, its predictability, the adults that are familiar and trusted and concerned about the young people, the social support from peers, that can provide the perfect post-trauma environment which will maximize their chance of recovery and ultimately possibly put me as a therapist out of a job. So teachers and school staff may not be therapists, but you're incredibly well placed to be therapeutic. I'm going to pause sharing there.
Thank you, David. I think hopefully, yes, can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Good. Really, thank you. You've made a really school-sensitive presentation there. I mean, without getting into the tacky, how do you teach, but you've nailed it in terms of giving us situations that relate to the school context. I was particularly taken with your phrase, the amygdala hijack, and then how that young man, you could see his logic based on his trauma. As you said, he interpreted the wrestling as him being attacked and so on. Could you just share, how did that get, and I say de-escalated, or how was that interpretation given? Because it could have just been seen as an attack and a major behavioural incident. So how did the reality, the understanding of his trauma-based needs come to be?
Yeah, thank you. So it's really important for me in my role to when I met with that teacher, to understand that he was attacked by a 16-year-old. You know, and when you've got a tall 16-year-old attacking you, your amygdala gets hijacked.
Yeah.
You know? And then I'm no neuropsychologist, but so it's a bit as like you've got two parts of your brain. You've got the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. And when a 16-year-old attacks you, your amygdala takes over. You haven't got time to remember your trauma-informed training you've been on or anything like. You need to keep yourself safe, and your amygdala does that for you. So the first thing is to really understand where that teacher was coming from, and then to gradually bring back online his prefrontal cortex and help him to understand and realize all those things that had happened, and to entertain the idea that this might be playing a part in what had happened. And then he was able to have a bit of a repair in the relationship, and then actually suddenly John, that boy, had some information that didn't fit. His expectation is that male adults, he would say, attack me, that's what they do. Well, here's a male adult that he thought attacked him, but now is being actually quite nice to him and discussing it, and it's beginning to undermine his view of the world in an incredibly therapeutic and useful way. But also, as well as giving him other events that don't fit with his view of the world, for him, it was also important that we went back to his experience of domestic violence, because for him, the information that adults that are supposed to look after me are dangerous was stored in that memory. So we can give him lots of examples in his new life of adults that don't attack him, but it was my job to unpick that memory with him as well and update the memory with this new information. So it's a real mix of both working on the meaning, and I very much had the teacher help me with that, and the memory, and that was the bit that I did with him individually in therapy.
That's fantastic, thank you. pausing just one moment, Matt's been able to put together the poll that we needed about where teachers came from. So, Matt, do you want to actually launch that? There it is. So, I'm just going to start to go through. There's been some really good questions come through, David, but can I ask people if they would fill in that poll just very quickly while I'm putting the first question to David? This will actually prove that teachers are capable of multitasking in a way that David referred to as gender at the beginning. It's what teachers do all day long. So, folks, can you start to fill in that poll, please, about which best represents your level of teaching? And just, can you fill in the poll on line, please? And just fill in the dot that's appropriate to you. There's been quite a string of questions, David, that relate to early years trauma, maybe things that have happened to children before they even come into school. And there's some interest here about strategies that people could use to help the self-regulation in the early years. How can we help children recognise their own signs, not perhaps by labelling them as trauma, but just, we know, for example, spontaneous urination is a sign of the anxious child. What could we offer them to help that regulation, start building that self-regulation process in the children from a very young age?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really important question, because it's not all about the traumatic events and, raking up the past and processing those memories, although I think that's often an important part of it. How do we help young people to develop the skills to regulate their emotions sometimes so that they can do the trauma focused work? And as I've said, I think those with the children for all those hours outside of the therapy session could play a crucial role. The families may be up to do some of that work, but sometimes they're not. In terms of teaching young people how to regulate their emotions, one of the first things, and many people here will be very familiar with this idea, is helping them to recognize them. So rather than just kind of be overwhelmed with this stuff, if they start to realize, oh yeah, this is me being excited, or this is me being scared, or whatever, or this is me being worried, or this is me being angry. So starting to have some very simple conversations about emotions. And this, I'm no teacher, but I'm guessing this could be weaved into all sorts of bits of the curriculum. My 7-year-old has just been learning all about the Fire of London. Some of those people must have been pretty scared. And you could have conversations, you could do a piece of written work about what it must have been like to be living next to the baker, or someone who wasn't even in London, but their house is burnt down. So they're not scared, but they're angry. There's all sorts of ways you can start to have emotional conversations. And then they can start to recognize their emotions, and then they can start, hopefully, to do something about it. And there's a lot of interventions I know in schools that are about emotional literacy and things like that. Yeah. And I just think some of those things are really useful, but it doesn't have to be just particular children that have that. I think it should be all children should be taught about emotions and what it looks like in other people and what it looks like in them and what they can do about it.
Thank you. There's a question just come through about, is there any research on the impact of putting traumatized children together in an educational setting? Because as you know, there are alternative provisions, and in fact, the new SEND green paper from the government, from DFE, is really stressing those alternative provisions. Does their hypervigilance and impulsive responses, do they bounce off each other and cause further distress, or can the approach be more unified and go for that whole thing about trauma-informed practice?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really great question. And there are definitely therapeutic opportunities in having groups of young people that have experienced trauma, but there are also significant risks, because if you've got these people who are on tender hooks and will lose their temper at the drop of a hat, and one of them kicks off, and then that's going to trigger another one, and you can end up with a sort of a chain reaction. But there are also opportunities, because they can start to talk about strategies they use. Oh, when you lost your temper last week, do you know what I would have done? I would have done this. And they can start to share some of their skills, and possibly even share some of their experiences. And there's some young people I've worked with that they don't want to talk to me about what happened, but they'll talk to a peer who may have been through something similar. So I think there are therapeutic opportunities there, but there are also risks that need to be managed really carefully.
Great. Okay. And in fact, you've just talked about sharing between pupils in class situation. Nice thing that happens in these sessions, David, is that teachers begin to share. And there's a comment just coming from John Farden saying that there's a wealth of resources about regulation from the Lincolnshire Behaviour Support Service available as a PDF online. John, I don't know if you've got a link you could post there for people to use, but really grateful to you for making that offer to your colleagues this evening. There's a question in from Amanda Ford. I was glad in your presentation, David, that you did go to the pandemic, because there just inevitably been an impact there, and I think there's going to be an impact in years to come, particularly in those children that didn't have either the cognitive abilities or linguistic skills at the age they were in the density of the pandemic, but they're carrying stuff that may begin to emerge. And if you parallel that to the literature around the earthquake in Christchurch, that was certainly true. 3 years plus even, things started to emerge from children that were in that 3 to 6 age group at the time of the earthquake. But Amanda is saying that obviously one of the legacies from the pandemic is about still teaching some pupils online who've become very anxious about school because of COVID fear and other factors. They're obviously providing encouragement and support while those young people are at home, so they don't miss out. But are there ways that teachers can encourage them back towards school rather than relying just on alternative provision?
I think so, and I really don't want to put any more work on teachers' plates, because I already think you're doing an amazing job and a lot of it. However, there are things I think, and again, it's about the meaning and the memory. So most of us went through those years of being told it's dangerous out there, you might die. You don't believe me? Here's a graph. Look at how many people have died. It was real. It wasn't scaremongering because it was all true. And the messaging was designed to keep us at home. And you can't just suddenly turn that off and say, okay, everything's fine now, out you come. Because we went through that. And for some young people, that was possibly traumatic, but it's a very strong message. We can't just suddenly say, oh no, it's fine. What are you doing at home? Come on, get to school. I think what we can do is give them very clear, accurate messaging about the actual risks, but also allow them to have conversations about that. Well, what are you actually worried about? Let's talk this through. Let's think this through. And when did you first start to think that? And allow them, I'm not suggesting everyone does trauma-focused CBT with them, but actually allows them to say, well, 2 years ago, I saw this graph and it was a number of people dying and that was really scary. And really give them the opportunity to reset, to recalibrate their risk assessment. But that takes time and it takes a relationship. I think that is the problem, is that you can't just suddenly change the messaging and expect everyone to come back to school. Some of them will be clinging to that old risk assessment because it was scary. That's what the risk assessment that people do in their brains is for, is to keep them safe. So we need to invest time, I think, and energy and effort into allowing people to recalibrate their sense of risk.
So one colleague's actually asked, you talked about hyperarousal. Can trauma also cause hypoarousal?
Yeah, so if we, very simplistic, we think about a level of arousal, most of us kind of bumble along here and the stressor makes us go up, and as we fall asleep, we go down. For some young people, actually, instead of fight or flight, they have a flop response where they just kind of turn off, they go emotionally numb, which again might be very functional in times of the actual trauma, to keep really still and to not feel anything. That could be really useful. But once the trauma has passed, then actually that response is not very helpful in most situations. So certainly some people will have this sort of flop response instead of a heightened response. Definitely that's a possibility as well.
And Nana Griffiths has asked, and we do ask this of speakers, will there be any guidelines that you'll be able to recommend for teachers to talk to parents about their child's trauma without producing feelings of guilt and shame in the parents?
Yeah, so that's two interesting bits. One is how do we not induce guilt and shame? We want families to be very much on board and to be helpful. So I think that takes time and ideally a relationship to be able to have those conversations. In terms of resources, that's a really interesting idea. So we do have some resources on the UK Trauma Council website, which I've just put up. What I might do is send around, there are some other resources for parents about trauma in children, and they could be used very easily by teachers. Actually, they could go through that with the parents. And when I've got resources like that, I'm always saying, so which bits fit for you and which bits don't, because not all of it's going to work. We don't have a one size fits all. So I could certainly send some other links for some other resources if that's useful.
Okay, thank you very much. That would be useful. Kate Stern says, you've made the point, David, that good schools with structure, routines, predictability can be very positive therapeutic environments. Is there any research on the impact of putting traumatized children in situations that might actually, if we're not careful, cause them further distress? What are the red flags we should avoid?
Yes, I mean, at the very least, we want to not re-traumatize children who've been through traumatic events. But I think that it's easy to say that. If you're with a young person many hours of most days, that's not quite as easy as it sounds, because you might not, first of all, you might not know about all their trauma. They may have been in a car crash and gone to hospital. And then when you do something in biology, actually it triggers them. They see a picture of a bone. That triggers what they saw sticking out of their leg or something. I just talked about the fire of London. What if they have a history of being in a fire? So I think we can't be expected to avoid each and every trigger that every child might get. I think the trick is to be just aware of it. And when you're showing a video, to keep an eye on the children, which ones are frozen in fear and which ones are engaging with it, and just be very sensitive to their reactions, and then pick it up after and say, oh, I noticed in that video you looked a bit, you look like you were glazing over. Were you bored or were you terrified? And actually having more conversations. But I think as we learn more and more about trauma, then we are more able to avoid those triggers and to work through anything that does trigger them. But I do feel it's a difficult area, because I don't want, as I said before, I don't want to put more work on teachers' plates. I don't expect them to be therapists, but I do believe they can be therapeutic.
Yeah, and you've whetted people's appetite, because there's lots of stuff coming through from colleagues asking, where can I go to find out more? Will you be providing a further reading list, David?
I will be now, yes. Thank you. And actually, I noticed someone's put in the chat Beacon House, which has some fantastic resources. Thank you, John. I should have thought about that. If you go to the Beacon House website, they've got some really lovely resources about what traumatized children look like in classrooms specifically. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, that's great. And Kat Stern again is asking, I've been hearing about other responses to trauma. She says submit, appease, etc. Are these well researched?
No. I mean, yeah, we're learning more and more about the way that people react to trauma, and those are certainly on the horizon. There will be some people that think those are really important, but they're not that well researched. And I think there comes a point where you have more different responses that actually becomes less useful. We see people who are generally fight, flight, freeze, or flop. I would stop there, I think, personally.
Yeah. And particularly if people want to look at that last bit about fight, fright, and freeze, then MindEd have recently refreshed their thinking around that on their website, which is a very, obviously, school-friendly website. So MindEd folks, I'm sure lots of you already use that, but yeah.
And actually, sorry, there's also Georgina's put in the chat about Louise Bomber's books, and they're very good as well. I'd highly recommend them.
Yeah, I would endorse that very much so. One from Melbourne Levant here. Is there much information available about supporting traumatized children who are non-verbal?
Yeah, that's always a more difficult one, because so much of what we do, certainly in therapy, is about verbalizing. Even if I do it very in a playful way, I might be drawing pictures, we might be using puppets, but often it is about creating that verbal narrative. So children that don't have those skills, we have to be very creative. And I've certainly worked with some children where there's been no speaking at all in the session, but we've used pictures and we've allowed them to still process what happened to them. So we've helped to tell the story, but using different techniques. So we have to adapt the model, obviously, to the young person in front of us. But I think it takes time and effort to enable a young person who doesn't have those skills to be able to process what's happened to them.
Okay. I think we've more or less come to the end of the questioning. There's a good comment just come through from Alicia Wood, the Chief Exec for Books Beyond Words, and reminding people that Books Beyond Words has got a huge series around emotions, dealing very much with trauma and anxiety. And of course, those are very much books that have no words, so you can pitch the conversation with the learner, or indeed the co-construction, co-creation of the story using the pictures in those books as a stimulus. Very much enables. I know Alicia, and I've used them extensively. In fact, my daughter Katie, who has Down syndrome, has written one of the books in that series. So I would recommend those to people. And they're not just for special school settings, folks. I've used them in mainstream settings with very traumatized children who basically are just not saying anything because they're so traumatized. So you at a loss of how to pitch the conversation. But the books are, please don't think because they're pictures, therefore they're infantile, because they are not, far from it. Some of them deal with sexuality issues and indeed sexual violence in quite explicit ways. So they're a really good resource, and the website is in the Q&A. Thank you, Alicia, for posting that. There's questions coming through about dysfunctional families and links to trauma. I wonder if that's perhaps one of the things you'll touch on in the resources?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, things need to be safe enough and stable enough to be able to think about the past. And if there is ongoing concerns that don't quite reach safeguarding levels, then actually we need to focus first on that very first principle is about safety and stability. How can we make sure that that's in place?
Yeah, okay. All right. David, you've got a couple of other slides in your pack that you agreed to move on. I need slide 39, if you can move us on to that, please.
Sure.
So thank you, everybody, for those questions. Can you continue doing what you've been doing, which is sharing web links with each other, and maybe where we haven't addressed some questions specifically, if any of you have got resources that would support that colleague's question, could you do that? There is a survey now that we're going to need you to take. Matt, do we want to upload the survey?
Yeah, my colleague's just going to put it into the chat.
Okay, thank you for doing that. And we're also going to be telling you about 2 other webinars that are coming up. Some of you remember that if you were on previous calls, that we've now developed a partnership with the Charter College for Teaching, so that for every topic that we've covered so far, there will be a pedagogy in practice, i.e. how do you teach? How does this impact on my school? So there'll be that follow-up. So at the end of this whole sequence of 10 Ask the Expert webinars, there will be 10 parallel pedagogy in practice webinars, and we'll have a repertoire of 20 webinars for you to dip into, to share. Everything is recorded, so you'll be able to go back. And indeed, the Charter College is going to be offering an accreditation strand if you're interested in getting a qualification just by attending these webinars and filling in some simple surveys. So if that's something for you, do look at the forthcoming Pedagogy in Practice.
Find out more about becoming an ACAM member and to be part of the advancement of child and adolescent mental health. Visit www.acamh.org.